All right, let's dive in. Today, we're unpacking one of history's biggest stories, how a single, powerful idea could travel across a continent, find the perfect tinderbox in Russia, and just explode. An explosion that would go on to define the entire 20th century. This is the story of a spark that became a fire.
So you have to ask, how does that even happen? How does an idea, in this case socialism, become a force so powerful that it brings a 300-year-old dynasty crashing down? Well, we're going to follow that trail, right from the intellectual debates in Europe to the revolutionary streets of Petrograd.
To really get the Russian Revolution, we have to start here, in 19th century Europe. You see, the French Revolution had basically kicked the door open, and all these radical new ideas about freedom, equality, and power were just spreading like wildfire. Suddenly, everything was up for debate.
Now, at the time, you basically had two main camps pushing for change. First, you had the liberals. They wanted things like a representative government, but, and this is a big but, they thought only men with property should get to vote. Then you had the radicals, who went way further. They wanted a government chosen by the majority. And a lot of them even supported women's right to vote. I mean, think about that. A truly revolutionary idea for the time.
But then came an idea that was even more radical. Socialism. This wasn't just about tweaking who gets to vote. This was about tearing up the entire economic rulebook. The core idea? That all the important stuff, the property, the factories, the land, shouldn't be owned by private individuals for their own profit, but by society as a whole. Yeah, right at the very heart of the socialist argument was this one simple diagnosis. Private property was the root of all evil. They believed it created a system where a tiny few got rich off the labor of the many. So, to build a better, fairer world, they argued you had to get rid of it completely. And that one idea, that was the spark for everything that was about to happen.
Okay, so if these ideas were popping up everywhere in Europe, why did they explode with such incredible force in Russia? Well, it's because Russia wasn't just another country. It was a powder keg just waiting for a match. The conditions there were, well, they were unlike anywhere else.
So while other European nations were busy building factories and industrializing, Russia was still overwhelmingly agricultural. I mean, look at this. A staggering 85% of the population were peasants working the land. This created a huge, massive class of people who had their own deep-seated anger towards the nobles who owned all that land.
And for the small but growing group of industrial workers in the cities, life was just brutal. We're talking 15-hour workdays, absolutely miserable wages, and women earning less than half of what men did for the same work. This wasn't just a list of complaints. This was the daily, grinding reality that created this desperate hunger for some kind of radical change.
All this discontent finally boiled over in 1905 in what a lot of historians call a dress rehearsal for 1917. It started with Bloody Sunday, when peaceful protesters were massacred by the Tsar's troops. That sparked strikes that literally paralyzed the country, forcing the Tsar to create a parliament called the Duma. But it was just a token gesture. The second the Duma started challenging his authority, he just dissolved it. The lesson was crystal clear. This regime was not going to give up its power peacefully.
And that brings us to the big one, 1917. The pressure had been building for decades, and now the whole system was about to shatter. But what's so crucial to understand is that it wasn't one single event. It was a rapid 1-2 punch, two totally distinct revolutions that would completely remake Russia.
So what was the final push? The First World War. For Russia, the war was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. It was the match that finally lit the fuse of that powder keg we talked about, stretching the already fragile state to its breaking point and turning all that simmering anger into outright rebellion.
Just try to wrap your head around this number. Over 7 million Russian casualties by 1917. The army was falling apart, soldiers didn't want to fight, and people back home were starving because all the food is being sent to the front. The war completely destroyed any credibility the Tsar's government had left. Everyone had simply had enough.
So, the whole system collapses in two stages. First, you have the February Revolution. This was a spontaneous uprising, sparked by striking women factory workers that actually led to the Tsar abdicating. But the provisional government that took over was weak, and it created this huge power vacuum. And that was the opening that a small, incredibly disciplined party, the Bolsheviks, would seize just months later in the carefully planned October Revolution. And the man with the plan was Vladimir Lenin. As soon as he returned from exile, he delivered his famous
April Theses. Now, the genius of his message was its incredible simplicity. He didn't bother with complex theory, he offered clear, simple solutions. End the war, now. Give land to the peasants, now. Nationalize the banks. His slogan, peace, land, and bread, was exactly what millions of desperate people were waiting to hear.
Of course, seizing power was one thing. Holding on to it and actually trying to build a new country, well, that was something else entirely. The years that followed the October Revolution were just a period of chaos, civil war, and incredibly brutal measures as the Bolsheviks tried to forge the world's first socialist society.
Almost immediately, the Bolsheviks faced massive opposition, and the entire country plunged into a horrifying civil war. You had the Bolshevik Reds fighting against the Whites, who were this loose coalition of everybody else, backed by foreign powers, and you also had these peasant armies called the Greens. It was savage, but in the end, the Reds, through ruthless discipline and control of the country's industrial center, they won.
After Lenin died, Joseph Stalin took over and launched one of the most radical social experiments in all of human history, collectivization. The idea was to completely end private farming and force millions of peasants onto these enormous state-controlled farms. The official goals were to modernize farming and break the power of wealthier peasants, who they called kulaks. This quote from a peasant named Afanasy Dendrovich Fribanev. It just brings the human tragedy of this policy into sharp focus. For millions of people, collectivization wasn't some grand economic plan. It was the violent theft of everything they owned. It was the complete destruction of their way of life. Many peasants resisted by just slaughtering their own animals rather than hand them over to the state.
And the results, they were catastrophic. The policy didn't modernize agriculture, it shattered it. The numbers are just staggering. A third of the nation's cattle were lost as peasants slaughtered them in protest. And this disruption, combined with the state seizing all the grain, led directly to one of history's worst famines, killing over 4 million people.
So what do we make of all this? What's the revolution's ultimate legacy? Well, it's incredibly complex. On the one hand, it inspired communist movements all over the globe and transformed Russia into the USSR, a global superpower. And yet, that achievement came at an unimaginable price: the total denial of basic freedoms and the use of brutal, repressive policies that cost millions and millions of lives. Which brings us right back to our final question. The revolution started with a promise, a beautiful promise of a world without exploitation, a world of true equality. But in the attempt to build that world, it created a new kind of state power that was both transformative and absolutely terrifying. So, what was its ultimate cost? That's the essential question that continues to define the story of the Russian Revolution.